Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us today. And welcome to the Americas LNG Summit webinar, American Energy Dominance, the First 6 Months, in partnership with Energy Connects. I'm Jason French, founder of French Coal Strategies, former executive director of the LNG Center of Excellence at McNeese State University, and chair of the forthcoming Americas LNG Summit. Nearly 400 people from all over the world have registered for today's webinar. Many thanks to all of you for your support. You're encouraged to submit your questions to our expert panel using the Q&A function. We'll try to get to as many of those as we possibly can as the morning goes on. Shortly, I'll introduce our panelists, but before I do, a quick reminder that America's LNG Summit and Exhibition 2025 returns to Lake Charles, Louisiana, October 19th through the 21st at Le Berge Resort. Additionally, we will reconvene next week for a second webinar focused on floating LNG infrastructure. I'm told that today's attendees will see a link below the slides this morning to register for that event, so please do so. The Lake Charles Summit and Exhibition will be the leading meeting place for LNG industry experts to share insights, collaborate, foster new relationships, and strengthen energy security. For more information, please visit www.americaslngsummit.com. Again, that's www.americaslngsummit.com. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our panel. Samantha Gross is Director of the Energy Security and Climate Initiative at Brookings Institution, one of the nation's leading think tanks. Her work focuses on the intersection of energy, environment, policy, geopolitics, and global energy markets. She is also host of Brookings Climate Sense podcast, which hosts excellent in-depth discussions on all things energy and climate. Samantha, welcome. Our next panelist is Ira Joseph, Senior Research Associate at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Ira is a prolific author and noted commentator on energy affairs, having recently been quoted in pieces by Reuters, Politico, and the New York Times. Additionally, if I may add a quick personal endorsement, Ira's feed on X or Twitter is essential reading if you care about global LNG markets. Welcome, Ira. And finally, I'm delighted to introduce Greg Upton, Executive Director of the LSU Center for Energy Studies. For those of us based in Louisiana, Greg needs no introduction. He's the leading voice on all things energy in this state. Greg's work focuses on energy and environmental economics. The author of over 40 publications, he has been called to give expert testimony before legislators at both state and federal level. Good morning, Greg. A reminder to all attendees this morning that you're encouraged to submit your questions to our expert panel using the Q&A function. I'll be watching that as the morning goes on, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. So with that, let's dive in to the morning's discussion. I'm going to start with you, Samantha. Obviously, the title of today is focused on the 6 months. We've had a new administration in the United States for the past 6 months, and it would probably be an understatement to say that it's been an eventful period, both geopolitically and for our nation. Geopolitically, energy trade. At this time of heightened geopolitical disruption, trade frictions, how has American LNG shaped and been shaped by international relations over this past 6 months?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. Thank you. And thanks to everyone in our audience for being here this morning. Just to start, I think a really key feature of US LNG is that it's not difficult to find buyers. The US is considered a reliable seller with rule of law and those sorts of things that really matter in contracts. People are very happy to tie into Henry Hub indexed prices. The lack of destination clauses is very appealing. And so I think it's helpful to start by pointing out that this is a product that kind of sells itself. However, it has gotten dragged into politics more lately, and not just in the last 6 months of the Trump administration. I understand Biden's desire to study the effects of the rapidly growing LNG industry in the States, but the politics and communication of that policy was pretty challenging and did kind of change a bit our reputation as a very reliable seller. And now Trump has some policies that are really quite inconsistent that I think are also sort of pulling LNG into politics in a way that is concerning. On the one hand, he's extremely supportive outwardly supportive of the industry. But on the other hand, some of his tariff policies make investments difficult and uncertain. The 50% tariff on steel, for instance, is very challenging for any kind of new concrete and steel project built in the US. But also, and I think maybe less considered, is the anti-climate tendencies of this administration are challenging for many of our most important customers. If you look at Europe and now Japan considering regulating the methane emissions of natural gas imports, this is really important for us. These are important customers. And the truth is that US operators are proving that they can make money with very low methane emissions. Our best operators are very, very good. But we really need to work with these countries to ensure that our LNG can continue to compete in these markets. And that's understood that our best operators are very, very good. But that's challenging in the current political environment when you're dealing with an administration that wants to push fossil fuels but doesn't want to be concerned about climate action. And so outwardly, the administration is very focused on energy dominance and pushing fossil fuels. But some of the policies behind the scenes are actually making that more difficult. And so I think that's shaping the role of LNG in markets and also sort of how we're seen as a reliable or less reliable supplier.
Greg, anything you'd like to add to that, specifically the thought that maybe some of the anti-climate policies run afoul of what some of the marketplace is looking for around the world from US LNG? How do you view that impacting the LNG industry, particularly here on the US Gulf Coast? Greg, are you able to hear me?
Sorry about that. I forgot to unmute myself.
No worries. No worries.
That's a great question, and something that we've been really watching closely. I was actually in Paris last week for an international energy economics meeting. So we had over 700 energy economists from over 50 countries convening there, and this was actually really central to that question. In terms of, what is the U.S.'s role in this global energy landscape? And so, kind of some stylized facts to back that up. If you look at total energy demand in the United States over the last decade, it's actually been incredibly flat. And the reason for that is, on one hand, you have, of course, economic growth, which leads to an increase in the demand for energy. But on the other hand, you have efficiencies. And as it turns out, in the United States, these are right in balance. And as it turns out, in Western Europe, these are also actually in balance. And so that demand's flat. Over the same time period, we've had an enormous increase in energy production. Oil production's increased, natural gas production's increased, renewable energy production's increased. And so what this has done is emerged the U.S. as really this exporter of these energy-based products. And so increasingly, of course, that, domestic policies matter and domestically, demand matters. But perhaps what is more important is what is happening to that demand growth in the growing developing world. And also, what is the willingness, if you will, of these global marketplace in order to purchase these lower carbon intensity products. And so one of the big pieces there, of course, is we're watching the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism in Europe, or CBAM, which is increasingly putting a carbon tax, if you will, on the products that are imported into Europe. And so this is really a huge thing in order to look at, kind of balancing. Yes, we've got to produce these products. We have to have them to be cost competitive. But to echo Samantha's point, you also have to really think about that carbon intensity. To kind of dive into, I think, two of the policies that I've been watching closely here in the United States. The first was, and Samantha alluded to these as well, the first is these supply restricted policies that the prior administration was implementing. And it started at the very beginning of the Biden administration. He had the executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. It paused offshore leasing while this comprehensive review was conducted. Then, of course, as this audience knows, talking about LNG, the pause in LNG export permits to non-free trade agreement countries. And so an economist would refer to these as kind of supply restrictive policies. Now, as people that were watching these knows that these didn't hold up in the courts. The IRA, whenever it was passed, it continued that offshore leasing. And in fact, oil and gas production actually ended up increasing throughout the Biden administration's term, as well as LNG exports. So now we've got this pivot to the Trump administration, which of course all of those have been reversed, and I think that that's good news for the industry. On the flip side, though, we've of course had these trade disputes, and one of the things we really watch closely is, again, going back to us being this global exporter. And so if these trade agreements are able to be negotiated and tariffs are a tool in order to ultimately get lower trade barriers, I think that'll be good for the LNG export industry in the long run. But of course, that's uncertain. And in the short run, I think a lot of these tariffs and other trade barriers, I think, reduce the probability that new projects move forward. So yeah, climate is a piece of it, as well as our domestic policies around trade and just the production and transportation of these products.
Thank you, Greg. I would like to point out for our audience, it does appear that we've lost Ira Joseph temporarily, so I'm not going to be throwing any questions to Ira until I've confirmed that he is back available to us. I think we're having a minor technical difficulty there. So Samantha, Greg, it's the three of us for the foreseeable, for the next few moments. Still building off of the first question, I see that the slide has gone forward, but I wanted to tap into specifically, because you both touched on it a bit, U.S.-China relations in regards to the tariffs. We've seen that demand in China for LNG has decreased this year for the first time in some time. I wonder if, when you in the LNG industry, often we look to Asia, China, and India as long-term markets for long-term global demand. I wanted to get any thoughts that either of you may have, and feel free to jump in regards to U.S.-China relations, where the tariffs have put that relationship, and how that's impacting long-term demand out of China for U.S. LNG or LNG overall. Samantha, you want to take that first?
Sure, I can say a few words on that. It has been very interesting to watch the U.S.-China tariff battle play out, because I feel like both administrations have wanted to use trade as a cudgel on the other one in order to change behavior, and that has just been a really interesting sort of the rock and the hard place kind of argument. So I think Trump and his trade people understand that setting the tariffs at a level that nearly cuts off the U.S. connection to the Chinese economy is not going to happen. It's terrible for our economy. We went through a time as this ripples through the supply chains in the United States. But I think the LNG exporters are kind of seeing Asia and China in particular as kind of a bottomless market that can absorb whatever LNG they can put into it. And I think the trade policies and the fact that Trump is trying to use trade as a coercive tool may change that opinion. And that, I think, is challenging for producers. And I'm really curious, Greg, if you see that as well. That's kind of looking at it from the 35,000 foot level and thinking how it might impact.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we look to the kind of early days of the LNG export in the United States, when of course we had all the shale gas come online, prices in the U.S. were incredibly inexpensive relative to Asia and Europe. You had Europe really implementing climate policies, saying that they didn't want fossil-based energy. And so a lot of those early deals that you were having were really to these Asian buyers. And I think that there was a big shift when Russia invaded Ukraine. of course, you had the price of natural gas increase precipitously in Europe, and this had an enormous impact, not only on the consumers there, but also on the industries there, right, that use natural gas as a feedstock, which had its own negative ripple effects. And so one of the things that I was really curious and have been looking at and talking to a lot of people is you could really see this as a pivot in one of two ways. On one hand, you could have Europe saying, look, we implemented this decade policy of decarbonization, that the strategy was stopping the import of fossil fuels, of course, with the notable exception of the Nord Stream pipeline coming from Russia, which ended up being, I think, perhaps a logistical error. I think that Europe would definitely admit that now. And saying, look, we're going to reverse this and we're going to start importing a lot more hydrocarbons. Or you could see a pivot of actually saying, well, no, look, this is the problem with hydrocarbons is we have to get them from all over the world, and we're going to kind of double down on these climate policies. And that's really the balance that's being happened. But when I see the shift away from shipments going from Asia, now shifting towards that European market. And so one of the big questions that I find interesting and that we're looking at is what is going to be the relative importance of that European market for LNG relative to the Asian market. On one hand, Europe, of course, is going to have a higher willingness to pay. Perhaps they're going to be willing to pay more for molecules from politically stable regions of the world, and also molecules that we can show credibly have a lower carbon intensity. On the other hand, the Asian markets is going to be where that growth is going to be. Europe hasn't seen economic growth in a decade, which is actually very different than the U.S., and that's a whole other, we could have a whole webinar just on that, of course. While Asia continues to rapidly expand and likely will rapidly expand, and for humanitarian reasons, hopefully rapidly expands in order to kind of catch up and bring, hundreds of millions of people access to transportation and electricity and products that you and I take advantage or take for granted every day. And so that's really going to be the balance. But I think in the short term, we've seen that European market actually be a more important market for the development of LNG over the last 5 years or so or I guess 3 years ago, since the Russian invasion relative to that Asian market. In terms of the long run, I'll be curious to see what is the share of global gas markets that are likely going to come from LNG. And so, of course, it's expensive to ship natural gas in the form of LNG, and there's an enormous value in the option to be able to move gas such in a global way, and that brings enormous value to that global market. But unlike oil, where you could have a very large share of the oil being shipped internationally, I'm not sure that we'll see that with natural gas. And the fundamental reason is because of those transportation costs. And so, kind of whether or not you see LNG as a source of kind of that base load energy in a growing, developing market, or whether you really see it having that critical mass of the amount of gas that can be shipped in a very nimble way, I actually tend to lean more towards the latter in that. And I think that we've seen that with, again, the shipments of shifting from Asia to Europe.
Great. Thank you all for your input on that first topic. Let's go ahead and move on into our second topic. And Greg, I'm going to start with you on this one. And you kind of touched on it in your first answer. But what do you see as the key changes at the federal level impacting the U.S. LNG sector during the first 6 months of the second Trump administration? And what do you see the long-term impacts? Have they provided certainty to the industry? Have they provided just reflect on your thoughts on those specific policy changes that have occurred during the Trump administration and where they're the impact on industry?
Yeah, so I think the shift away from supply restricted policies has very much benefited the energy sector in the Gulf Coast region of the U.S. And, the prior administration really had a big pivot. I mean, we had many years of kind of stable energy policy with offshore leasing, with export that was really impacted. And so, of course, the Trump administration changing that, I think, is good news. But kind of the bad news is that the uncertainty has been introduced, right? And now can investors anticipate having it kind of bounce back and forth between administrations. And of course, when you're planning billions of dollars of investment that take years in order to develop, that uncertainty is really not helpful. The additional uncertainty that's been added, again, is with the trade policies. It was kind of interesting to watch in the first Trump administration, and of course you had the quote unquote tariff or the China trade war, and then the Biden, whenever he was a candidate, was kind of critical of this. But then whenever he came into office, it was actually incredible to see how consistent that trade policy actually was. A lot of those tariffs that were implemented on China were kind of quietly continued. And then we saw through the IRA, for instance, additional trade barriers being put up in terms of, requirements for domestic manufacturing within the Inflation Reduction Act. And so we've, again, saw this kind of ratcheting up of this protectionism policy. Now, of course, I think that's been ratcheted up further again with the Trump administration, with, of course, we had the Liberation Day tariffs, and that was, kind of viewed to be a negotiation tactic. Of course, a lot of those have been backed off of now. But this trade uncertainty, I think, is a really big deal, not only in terms of companies making plans in terms of, hey, I'm going to invest in this LNG export facility or other types of manufacturing facilities that, of course, there's capital involved, and that capital is going to come from all over the world, but also uncertainty from those buyers who want to sign a long-term contract with a U.S. producer and questioning, well, what will be that trade policy in the future? So I think my biggest advice to policymakers, and you can discuss policy A versus policy B and the pros and cons, and we have that discussion all day. But uncertainty is something that I think is also should be really thought about carefully. And when new administrations come in, not having kind of this whiplash of policies moving back and forth is also something to think about.
I'll add, I couldn't agree more with everything he said. And I'll add something that I think has been a difficult theme with the energy dominance strategy of the White House. And that is this desire to use U.S. energy supplies as a lever. And I spoke about this earlier, as a lever to encourage certain kinds of behavior on the part of our trade partners. And it is frustrating. And one of the advantages of U.S. LNG is that we have a rich market with a lot of different suppliers, and it's apolitical. And so taking this apolitical product and bringing it into the political process and trying to use it as a lever to encourage or discourage behavior is a real challenge and a shame. We don't need to force our LNG on folks. It's a product that largely sells itself. And so that's disappointing to see, and I think it's challenging for our relationships.
Let me just follow up, Greg, and Samantha, really. Do you view the policy changes that have occurred over the past 6 months as the primary driver in the recent flurry of commercial agreements that have been signed? You've had an FID on Woodside's Louisiana LNG project. Cheniere announced just yesterday a new expansion of their Corpus Christi project. You have NextDecade moving to a second phase already on their project. It does seem that over the past 6 months, there have been a flurry of both FIDs and long-term SPAs that have been signed in the LNG industry. I'm curious how each of you look at that, if that has been primarily driven by policy changes under the new under the second Trump administration, or if there are other factors at play that have led to that commercial flurry of activity. Start with Greg, or go ahead, Samantha. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no,
go
it's
ahead.
okay. Yeah,
go ahead, Samantha.
It's all good. I mean, my gut feeling is that because of the stoppage during the Biden administration, that there was a bit of, let's picture that being a dam with water flowing in behind it. And there were projects that wanted to move forward, that had the economics to move forward, that couldn't during that time. And so I think rather than a positive response to Trump administration policies, it's a response to the lifting of the pause. And so it's not so much we have more than we otherwise would have had. I feel like the projects that were caught behind the dam are now flowing, because I think the uncertainty that many of the other policies raise, I think, have and somewhat balanced out his encouragement of the industry. But I'd be curious if others agree with that assessment.
Yeah, so I'm going to have to bring in my dismal scientist here hat on this answer. So I think that we have and this isn't a comment on either policies of either administration, but I think that we have, as the general public, a tendency to attribute way too much to what's happening politically. And, as an economist, I'm looking at markets, I'm looking at what's happened in Asia, what's happened in Europe, what's happened to, spreads between, JKM and TTF and Henry Hub. And when we model these things, those are really the factors that ultimately we look at and ultimately drive these decisions. And I think it's very natural when administrations come in, and by the way, this happens at the state level, happens at the federal level, even happens at the local level, at the police juror, who comes in, and there's some, big announcement that happens, and, one administration will decide to really, hype up and talk a lot about the things that really resonate with that base, while another administration might not focus on those things. They might move forward, but might really, drive, really focus on the other. And so I'm a little bit skeptical that a change in administration had a dramatic impact on these project announcements, which are years and years of planning in the making, within a few months of that administration coming in. And again, that's not a critique on this administration by any means, but I'm always, my skeptical hat always comes on when there's any administration change, and then there's this huge announcement for these projects that have been planned for years and kind of taking credit for those activities. The other things I'll note is that, and I pulled the numbers this morning before, but LNG exports under the Biden administration increased by 36% over a 4-year period. And again, I don't think that was because of a policy decision that the Biden administration wanted that to occur. I don't think that was their policy objective at all. But I think it just speaks to, we talk about politics a lot and what's happening in Washington. But again, me as the economist, I don't know. I seem to think that is that the effects of that are over exaggerated generally, and it's really the core economics that drives a lot of these decisions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. And I will add that despite the Biden administration pause, there was still a large additional growth in LNG supply coming online that was set to come on before the pause. 6 months is a blink in the eye in the lifetime of one of these projects.
Well, great insights from you both. As someone who gets called on this a lot, I will point out for our international and national audience, police jurors are essentially county commissioners. I always get asked, what do the police have to do with energy policy? And since Greg used that, we do things differently down here in Louisiana. Police jurors are essentially our county commissioners. I have a question from our audience, a question regarding some of the policy changes and where we are in policy. What do you think of and I'll either of you can jump in on this. What do you think about a recently proposed rule by the U.S. Trade Representative that would require a minimum percentage of LNG to be shipped via U.S. manufactured vessels starting from 2026? I know that's a relatively fresh headline, but if either of you have any thoughts on that, obviously Jones Act issues in relation to the LNG industry, but do either of you have any thoughts on that possible recommendation that's floating out there?
Yeah, sure. So, I think that what we've seen over the last decade is really, and what economists refer to as this era of what we call deglobalization. And so when you go back to the 1990s, you had the World Trade Organization and a lot of the policies there that really liberalized trade globally. And that's when we saw, a lot of the manufacturing in certain sectors exit the U.S. and a lot of the higher income countries. Why? Because you had this lower cost labor in other parts of the world. And while consumers benefited from these lower cost products, of course, you had individual industries and individual geographic regions of the country. This isn't just in the U.S. This is again all over the world that were negatively impacted by that. And this ultimately is a hard thing, that it's the kind of this idea of creative destruction that economists talk about. And globalization has different impacts on different people. And what I think we're seeing now is the tide turning towards this era of deglobalization. And an example of that, of course, is Brexit. We've seen a lot of these tariff kind of policies. And as I mentioned earlier, the Biden administration continued a lot of those and then doubled down in the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of its kind of deglobalization and trade protectionist policies. And so I think that this policy that you mentioned is just another example of that kind of long-term trend of really this kind of fundamental distrust in market economies, and this fundamental distrust that trade's going to flow to the most efficient place and is going to make people better off. And that's ultimately, you could talk the economists, the theoretical, kind of best condition, but in reality, these policies or these trade movements impact people differently, and this is what leads to these kind of policy proposals. That's ultimately a protectionist policy.
And to add a brief and very practical point to that, the idea that the market for LNG tankers is somehow going to change between now and 2026 is bananas. That's not a policy with a deadline like that encourages U.S. shipbuilding. It's just something that increases costs. And that, that policy seems to completely miss the reality of how long it takes to build one of these things. And it seems entirely designed to increase costs. It's a little crazy.
Right. All right. So as the host this morning, I want to apologize to our audience. Ira Joseph is having some fairly intense technical difficulties from what I understood, suffering the nightmare of the complete computer crash. He just popped up on my screen, but then also disappeared because I was about to throw a question to him. If Ira is able to join us, we will pull him into the conversation. I'm sure he'll have a lot to add, but I did want to apologize to our attendees that he has not yet been able to join us. Let's go ahead and move on to our third topic today. And I'll start this one with you, Samantha. What do you view, looking out to the horizon, what do you view as some of the most likely impediments to a growing U.S. energy dominance or growing the U.S. LNG industry? Obviously, we have Russian gas, much of which from a policy decision has been made to cut that off from Europe, but we don't know where the future of Russian gas stands. Looking at kind of macroeconomics, geopolitics, Russian gas, what do you see as impediments to kind of this idea of American energy dominance in the global marketplace?
Sure, and I'll stick, I think, primarily to natural gas and LNG in this answer. I've done a lot of work with my European colleagues and friends, both at Brookings and outside, on gas supply in Europe. And the question of Russian gas is a very interesting one. And it's answered differently by people in the political and security sphere versus people in the energy sphere. When I talk to people on the security side, their answer is, oh, absolutely not to a return of Russian gas supply. We've seen this movie before. We know how it ends, and we don't want to give money to the Russians to continue their military aims. People on the energy side are a little more sanguine about it. They do miss those inexpensive gas supplies, and so that interplay is very interesting. I think right now the security people are clearly winning. But it's important to know that there are folks on the energy side and the demand side who might be interested if the opportunity arose. So that could potentially be one impediment to U.S. supply to Europe, although I think that may be slightly less likely. I honestly think one of the main impediments to LNG sort of taking over the world, especially the lower income world, was alluded to earlier, and that's the idea of price. It is expensive to ship natural gas in this way around the world, and it's great for optionality if you can afford it. It was great for Europe. They had a lot of optionality there, but the way that worked out is that they paid a pretty penny for that gas and then sucked it in from other parts of the developing world who went without and largely went back to coal. So I think price is going to be a really important factor, and whether it's competitive with other domestic forms of energy, particularly in electricity supply, both coal on the dirty side and renewables on the clean side. It's kind of stuck in between. So I really think that's the primary question. Wealthy countries will continue to use LNG. They like the optionality, they want the cleanliness. But in the developing world, I think the question is whether or not it's affordable and how it compares to other sources.
All right. Thank you, Samantha. Doing this live event, I'm going to try to throw this to Ira now. I see Ira. Hope your connection holds with us, Ira. We're talking about what you would view as some of the most likely impediments to U.S. energy dominance, specifically talked about Russian gas that's been cut off from the European markets, but looking to the horizon, really take it any direction you'd like on where you see some of the most likely impediments to a growing U.S. LNG markets or to U.S. energy dominance. And welcome to the webinar. Sorry you've been having so many troubles this morning.
Sorry, it was a really bad day for my computer to crash for a half an hour, so I blame myself. I think, and if this has been covered before, I apologize because it sounds like Samantha is barking up the same tree I am. But I think one of the big impediments to American energy dominance is that America seems to be going down a different road in terms of policy, which is that there seems to be like this very strong sort of culture war demonization of renewables. And as I've said on Twitter many times, if you're an oil and gas exporting country, you want to deploy renewables as quickly as possible, because the more you deploy renewables, the more oil and gas you have to export. So I think the U.S. doing a energy version of the metric system versus imperial unit divide that happened 60 years ago, I think could easily happen again, where the U.S. ends up, being an oil and gas economy and coal for what's left of it, and then the rest of the world going in a different direction. So I think, and the reason that is it makes the U.S. so vulnerable is because there are very real concerns about whether U.S. upstream, particularly gas production, can service both the growth in domestic demand if all of this data center and AI demand grows. I haven't heard everybody's views on that. Plus also trying to grow LNG exports. And the fact that U.S. LNG is really the only non-integrated LNG, industry around the world, the U.S. upstream is doing something completely different than the LNG business, and their thoughts and their way they want to deploy their capital is completely different than LNG as well. So that divide, is on top of the pullback on renewables or making renewables harder to deploy in the U.S. potentially. I think, it creates a vulnerability to the energy dominance strategy. I hope you heard all of that.
We did, at least I did. Greg, any thoughts on this topic?
Oh man, many thoughts. I'll try to, give just a few nuggets. So there's really three things that we really think about a lot in our outlooks. The first is, of course, what's going to happen to that global demand growth. And we've got these two trends going on. You've got the developed world that has not had demand growth for energy, again, because of that balancing of efficiency and economic growth, and the developing world. And so that's number one, is kind of what does that look like moving forward? In our lifetimes, it's actually feasible that we could see a peak BTUs used in the global economy. And so when that is and that's not a peak oil from a production end, that's actually from the demand end of how much do you have these innovations in terms of the demand side. So that's number one. The second, of course, is as geopolitics and really the supply of energy. That has been really, really important. I think a lot of the growth that we've seen in LNG over the past few years has really been spurred by, in this, it's terrible, the humanitarian crisis and all that is really terrible. But I think that a lot of the increase in LNG exports we've seen over the last few years, it really has been spurred by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and then the sanctions that went on from that. And so again, will we continue to see this fractured energy market globally, or are we going to go back to this era where the globe trades? And that's a double-edged sword for the U.S., right? On one hand, you want to participate in this global market, but on the other hand, having these areas of supply that is not being supplied to the market for geopolitical reasons has implications. And the third is this balancing of decarbonization. And that really is a lot tied to the first bullet point on global demand growth as well. Here in Louisiana, and Jason, you know this well, it's this balance where companies are trying to produce these products. And this isn't just LNG, it's liquid fuels, chemicals, plastics, fertilizers. We have a huge announcements for steel manufacturing. Hyundai was here actually this week. I got to meet with them, was awesome. We've got Meta is building a data center in Louisiana, one of the largest data centers in the world. And all of this energy intensive manufacturing are trying to strike this balance of how do you produce these products in a way that's cost competitive, but also in a way that we're competitive in terms of our emissions intensity. And ultimately, striking that balance is determined by what is that global market's willingness to pay for those lower carbon intensity products. And so I think that those are kind of the three highlights of bullet points in terms of, what will impact the broader, the next decade of whether or not we continue to see the increase in growth of energy production and export here in the U.S.
Great. Well, both you and Ira have mentioned something that leads us into our next topic. And Ira, I'm going to start with you on this one. To expand on, you actually mentioned it, but how do you view domestic needs for natural gas, the U.S. domestic energy demand interfacing with our ambitions to be this global LNG superpower? Obviously, you've mentioned some of the AI centers, but with growing domestic demand, how does that interface with export plans, in your view?
I mean, I think it's complicated because I'm hearing anybody who wants demand growth, mainly the suppliers, telling two different stories. One is that the AI data center demand growth story is a stranded gas story. So we're gonna put data centers in West Texas and Western Pennsylvania and West Virginia because there's a lot of stranded gas there. We can't build the pipelines to get the gas out. It's cheap. That's the story. Blah blah blah. And then another aspect of this is that the data center AI demand, it has a very, very high bearable price. And that is a much, much more bullish story to tell, because then you're saying, a data center can basically come into any market and outbid anybody for the gas prices. And then that's when you get into some serious policy issues locally and regionally about the potential to raise gas prices domestically for everyone else just because the data centers are deployed there. So that makes that very, very tricky. And then, of course, the add-on effect of that is that then it gets very, very tangled up in U.S. gas exports, either via LNG or via Mexico. One could easily make a protectionist argument from the left or the right towards restricting gas exports or oil exports of anything, especially these days, given the way the market is so influenced by tariffs and so influenced by geopolitical events. But domestically, I think sorting out whether this is a stranded gas story or whether this is a underlying growth story, or whether it's going to be a growth story at all, and maybe this is just another version of fiber optic cables or Y2K, is hard. I don't know the answer to that yet, and I'm still trying to sort of assess that myself. But again, repeating back to what I said before, we're putting a lot of pressure and a lot of confidence in U.S. upstream to produce another 20, 30, 40 billion cubic feet a day of gas. At the same time, U.S. upstream is telling us that tier 1 acreage is gone and we're going to be in tier 2 and tier 3. Again, these are stories that are sort of contradicting each other in a lot of ways. And so it makes it really difficult to assess, the push and pull of domestic demand versus export-oriented demand. We didn't even get into price, but we can do that at another point.
Samantha, your thoughts? Samantha, I know you cut out briefly. We are talking about U.S. domestic energy demand interfacing with our ambitions for export dominance, just to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I cut out for a second, the vagaries of the internet. But yes, I mean, the data center issue is huge here in the United States. I feel like I can't have a conversation with anybody without it coming around to demand for data centers and artificial intelligence. And I think ultimately, particularly the AI side, can help us reduce energy demand and find efficiencies and improve our systems. But that's going to be a lagging indicator. We're going to have more electricity demand before these efficiencies start to kick in. And I think a lot of that, particularly in the near term, is going to be met by natural gas, particularly in the next 3-4 years. After that, I think you'll start to see some new sources come online to power these centers, advanced nuclear, geothermal, et cetera. But in the near term, those facilities are going to be largely powered by gas. And so we've gone, and forgive me if someone said this already, from 15 years or so of perfectly flat U.S. electricity demand to demand looking like it's going to grow maybe 3% a year or so. And that is not nothing. And that, I think, will be a challenge, not just from the gas supply side, but from getting these facilities built, finding the gas turbines, et cetera. And so the U.S. has plenty of gas, but the question is whether all the systems can keep up.
Yeah, so we for years our energy outlook, and we release it every fall. This has been one of our kind of base assumptions, which is that domestic energy demand flat, demand globally growing, and this has been a driver of our forecast for petrochemical employment and upstream and how those interplay. And over this last year, I've heard this question so many times of, well, Greg, what about data centers, right? What about electric vehicles? What about all these new sources of demand that could come online? And so in our last outlook, which again we released last fall, we ran the following analysis. And this isn't meant to be a projection, but it's meant to be illustrative of kind of, to put it into perspective. So we considered three things. We considered electric vehicles, heat pumps, and data centers. And these are the three things that are talked about a lot in terms of especially increasing the demand for electricity. And so we did the following hypothetical. We said, okay, what would happen if every single light duty vehicle on the road today were to move to an electric vehicle? And as it turns out, when you do the calculations and you think about the heat rate of a power plant, and you compare that with an internal combustion engine that you're driving down the road, perhaps unsurprisingly, the power plant is way more efficient at taking the energy within the molecules and actually, getting the electricity out of it. Then you have line losses, right? So you're going to lose some of that energy transporting it, and then it's going to go in that electric vehicle. As it turns out, when you do all these calculations, and the engineers tell me, is that the total BTUs of energy needed to drive a mile of an electric vehicle is actually lower than an internal combustion engine, again, because of those physics. And it's not inherently the case. That's just what the kind of physics tells us. So in our analysis, if every single car on the road were to become an electric vehicle, again, this is light duty, you would actually see a 9% reduction in BTUs in the total economy, but about a 30% increase in electricity demand. Run the exact same scenario with heat pumps, and you get about a 4% reduction in BTUs and an 11% increase in electricity demand. And then we took the EPRI study, so the Electric Policy Research Institute, they had a great study that they put out on data centers. And we assumed no increase in efficiency because of the data centers and the AI, which I think there will be efficiencies, but let's just assume that there are none. And we took their most aggressive scenario out to, I believe it was 2035. And the total increase in energy needed to power all the data centers in the most aggressive scenario was 1% of US BTUs currently. And again, that was their most aggressive scenario, but again, about 6% of electricity demand. And so my take from this is that, our outlook is really unchanged in terms of, in fact, you might even have, as electrification occurs, you might actually have more rapid reductions in the total BTUs of energy need, but the share of that energy coming from electricity is likely to increase. And so, the International Energy Agency has coined this new era of electrification. And I think that sometimes we talk about the increase in demand for electricity and kind of use that interchangeably with an increase in demand for energy. But I think it's a kind of a more nuanced story for that. So as you said, as you have perhaps energy demand be flat or maybe even reduced, it gives you that ability to export those molecules all over the world. Of course, the supply's got to be there. Our projections is that the supply increase is feasible for the next decade or two, but the demand reducing can actually impact your ability to increase those exports.
Great, thanks, Greg. With only about 10 minutes left in the webinar today, I want to make sure that we get to audience questions. So if anyone has any questions they'd like addressed here, please go ahead and add them in the Q&A box. But this question comes from Don DuPont. We've had lots of comments today about Asia and Europe as sources of global LNG demand. Ira, I'm going to come to you first on this one. What about Central and South America? Do we view those as potential demand markets for U.S. LNG? Don cites the fact that they're heavily energy independent upon oil with very little fracking capabilities in those regions. Wanted to get your thoughts on Central and South America as potential demand centers.
Well, Central America is certainly a potential demand center. It's just that the volume isn't very big just because there aren't a lot of people in Central America. So there's definitely a lot of oil to gas switching potential there. But then, I think as Samantha mentioned before, the affordability is a key issue here. And LNG always has the problem of being really, really expensive relative to coal and in even renewables. So, whereas maybe 5 years ago, I would have looked at an oil gas switching opportunity kind of the way New Fortress Energy has in switching away from fuel oil or diesel for Central America to LNG. I think sort of the bridge for gas to meet that demand is sort of narrowing and getting shorter over a time span. South America is different. I mean, I think the sort of revival in offshore drilling, particularly in Brazil, is going to lead to a lot more gas production there. I think Argentina's aspirations to become a net exporter of gas again, like they were 25 years ago, seems to be quite serious. And as long as the government that is in there right now, I think it's really going to be beneficial for shale development in Vaca Muerta basin in particular. So I don't see huge, volumetric potential, and that's really what's most important here because, as you probably said before I got on, the problem with LNG used to be trying to find the supply. Now the problem with LNG is finding the demand, and so South America will, I think particularly seasonally need LNG, but I don't see like a big uplift for gas in that region at all. And for Mexico, I would say another 2 Bs a day maximum versus what we have now, maybe 3, because the gas is so cheap, the ship channel price or the price at Agua Dulce is so cheap relative to Henry Hub, I could see some demand side increase from there as well.
Samantha, Greg, do you have any thoughts on that topic?
Only to agree with what
I'll go on, Samantha.
Oh, you're both being polite. Samantha, you go first.
No, I was just going to say only to agree with everything that I've heard. Like, I think you'll see demand growth there, but I think there's also a lot of indigenous supply growth. And so it may be a demand center, somewhat a demand center for natural gas, but I don't see it being a huge demand center for LNG because I think a lot of that supply may be produced locally.
Greg?
Yeah, and my one quick comment is that, that's really the benefit of LNG is that it can be switched, where it goes very, very, very rapidly. And so while I think a lot of the contracts are, again, the buyers in Asia and Europe, but all it takes is one disruption and you can have, that gas easily transported to Latin America and South America. So I think that's the big benefit that I see more so than being a source of, energy for demand growth.
Great. Greg, this next question, moving on to our next planned topic, I'm going to start with you, being that you're here on the Gulf Coast with me. How do you view the U.S. Gulf Coast being impacted by the growth, the proposed expansions, new wave of FIDs of U.S. LNG production and export facilities that are now coming? How do you see our area here in Louisiana and Texas, the U.S. Gulf Coast, being actually impacted, real life impacts by that expansion?
Yeah, so the biggest impacts, and this we talk about global markets and all these kind of things, but just for the people that live here, I think it's easy to forget the property tax base that comes from these multi-billion-dollar facilities. And so we've got, these parishes that here in Louisiana, we call counties parishes, and how our state government is set up is that the local governments are able to assess a property tax and the state largely cannot do that. And so a lot of the revenues come from that. And so when a LNG export facility comes in, again, a multi-billion-dollar facility, and when that starts coming on and paying taxes to those local governments, it has an enormous impact on the infrastructure that they're able to build out, the schools and all those kind of things. The other thing that's kind of interesting in terms of those local impacts is historically you would have facilities would come in and they would employ, hundreds, if not thousands of people at these industrial facilities. And in a way, there's a lot of discussion of, well, what are the jobs that I'm going to get? You've had automation, and this isn't just LNG, this is all the facilities where they're just so much more efficient because of the automation that we have today, and you need a lot less actual workers showing up at those facilities every day. And in one hand, people kind of view that as, well, where are my jobs? But on the other hand, when you have a lot of people that show up there for work every day, well, that means you have more people on the road, and you have to maintain those roads. And those people have more, they have children that are in the local schools, and now there's increased cost in order to of course, educate those kids that are in those local schools. And so LNG has been a really good example. Not that there aren't jobs and good paying jobs in those, but it's really transformed some of these communities in terms of the property tax base that their local governments have to run their schools and their roads and those local services. And I think on a global scale, that kind of local benefit is oftentimes overlooked.
Greg, we just had and this will require a quick follow-up for a somewhat complicated answer, I know, but we just had a question come in on the Q&A. Don't most of the LNG plants get property tax relief? So could you, as quickly as one can do, try to explain the property tax relief, particularly here in Louisiana?
Oh my gosh, can we do a whole webinar on this?
Yeah, I know.
So, the bottom line is we have what's called the Industrial Tax Exemption Program in Louisiana, that when a new facility comes in, it gets an 80% property tax abatement for 10 years. But the value of that 20% is still significant to that community. And after the 10-year mark, it's even more significant. So yes, there's obviously property tax, policies in place. But I think in net, the economist doesn't look at what's the value of the exemption. I think a lot of people talk about that a lot, but the economist really says, well, what is the tax burden and what is that? And so, yeah, these communities have gotten a lot of property taxes.
In the interest of our evaporating time and that Ira wasn't with us for the first half, I think I'm going to throw Ira, any thoughts on this, on how the U.S. Gulf Coast or the U.S. has been impacted by a second wave of LNG development? And then any other final thoughts? I know you had the least time with us today, so any other final thoughts you want to add to any of the general topics, please do.
No, I don't have a lot. No, I'm sorry. I just don't have a lot on taxation on the U.S. Gulf Coast. Just not really my world. I think, I think it will be interesting to see how much domestic demand growth increase we can have, on the U.S. Gulf Coast. Again, it is a producing area, but it's kind of not a producing area unless you include obviously Haynesville in there. So the gas that's sort of stranded behind the pipe here that I think is really the focus of either how we get it to the Gulf Coast and whether that means demand growth or whether that gets stuck behind the pipe and we end up with more data center and AI development in Texas or Pennsylvania. I just wanted to also add one thing on the data center discussion because it's so interesting. I wrote a paper for Columbia about the globalization of power demand as well, because when you look at Facebook, Amazon, Google, NVIDIA, et cetera, the security issues are immense here, and I don't wish to underplay them. But the ability for these companies to migrate their power demand and their data center use around the world on a real-time basis is a very real factor in all this. And when I first noticed this in the crypto market, where people were chasing the cheapest dollar per kilowatt hour, around the world in order to mine coins, it made me realize that the same thing could happen with data center use also. Obviously, there are huge security issues involved with that as well, but I didn't want to go past this without sort of pointing out that is definitely a possibility. And why that is also significant is because most of the world's use and power use and power consumption in many countries in the world is heavily subsidized and heavily controlled by governments as well. So on the one hand, it may lead to more migration to other countries, but then again, it may lead to other countries also banning data center and AI use in their markets because it's gonna push up prices and it's gonna push up demand for power.
Great. Thank you, Ira. As I look to the clock, we are in our final 60 seconds of our scheduled webinar this morning. I want to thank each of you for a fascinating webinar this morning. Greg Upton, Ira Joseph, and Samantha Gross. Thank you also to Energy Connects for hosting us today. As we mentioned earlier, we'll be back next week with the second and final webinar in this series entitled Floating LNG Infrastructure, Supply and Demand Side Solutions for Evolving LNG Markets. I'll be joined by speakers from Energos Infrastructure, Fluor, and Black and Beach for another fascinating discussion, hopefully. Another reminder also that America's LNG Summit and Exhibition 2025 returns to Lake Charles, Louisiana on October 19th through the 21st at Le Berge Resort. The agenda is shaping up nicely, and we're going to have exciting high-profile speakers from both government and industry joining us, and we hope that you can do the same. For more information, please visit www.americaslngsummit.com. Finally, please note that you will soon receive an email containing instructions on how to access a recording of this webinar. Please do feel free to share this with your colleagues and peers. And thank you to all of you around the world for attending and sharing this webinar with us today. Thanks, and until next week.
Still on? Still on there?
Yeah, I think we shut down now.